Hello. Yeah.
Could I please request all of you to be seated and let us start the program? Even people from outside, if they could be called in. Good evening, everyone. Could I have your attention, please? Let's start the program. Let's start the actual discussion, which will lead to more other discussions. In memory of Professor Rabindranath Bhattacharya on his death anniversary, Rutledge and Taylor and Francis and India International Center, New Delhi, cordially welcomes you to the book discussion on his honor. The book is Environmental Economics in Developing Countries, Issues and Challenges, edited by Achiransu Acharyya. So let's begin the program. I call upon Achiransu to talk about the book, and then we'll proceed. I'll first call, okay. So our speakers today are Professor M.N. Murthy. Could I please request? Okay. So Professor M.N. Murthy had conjunctivitis, so he's unable to attend. Professor Shrikant Gupta, could I please invite you on the dais? And I call upon Pooja to felicitate him. Professor Shrikant Gupta. Can we have a hand? Make it a little joyous. Please take your place here. Professor Gupta, please take your place. Professor Purnamita Dasgupta. Please, we'd like to felicitate you first, so please come to the dais, in front of the dais. Pinaki Chakraborty is here. So Professor Pinaki Chakraborty has been unable to make it because of unavoidable circumstances. We have Asim Srivastava. I pronounced it like a Bengali, sorry. Asim is fine? Okay. Could you please, Pooja, I call upon you to felicitate Professor Srivastava. And Achiransu, please come up. You don't want to be felicitated? No, please. Later, maybe, if I do a good job. Okay. Should we start the program now, or you want to start the panel? I'll introduce. When I invite people, I'll introduce.
When you invite people, you introduce. So I'm going to talk now, and then Sudhanshu
Okay.
will talk about it.
Okay. So Achiransu, I invite you to talk about the book. Give us an idea. Please do.
A very good evening, and I welcome you all to this program in honor of a person who was not only a teacher and an academician, but a very humble and a good man, Professor Rabindranath Bhattacharya. Today we assemble here to remember him and his works, and I have tried to bring together across the globe academicians to contribute in his honor, and this book is to his honor. So I thank you all for coming here, for remembering him, and I thank all the panelists here, Professor Purnamita Dasgupta, Professor Srikant Gupta, and Professor Ashim Srivastava, to have come here. Unfortunately, Professor Emin Murthy has conjunctivitis. He's unable to come. He wanted to come. And Professor Pinaki Chakrabarty has some other problems, so he couldn't come. So I'll just talk a little bit about this book and how I have done it. So the idea is that every Sunday, I and Professor Bhattacharya would meet at the coffee house in Jadavpur, and we would discuss all kinds of things. And suddenly, we were discussing about books coming out about academicians in honor, and I just told him that, sir, there should be a book on you also. But he's so humble, he felt very ashamed, and he said, no, there shouldn't be any book on me. Why should you have a book on me? So I then told him, okay, sir, let me just try, give me a chance. Let's see if people, how they accept it. So then ultimately agreed, and I approached some of the academicians who knew him. And strangely, everyone, almost everyone agreed to contribute a chapter in his honor. So I'm grateful to all the authors who have contributed in this book. And I'll just say a few words about the book. There are two editions of the book, one, the international one, and this came out in October 2022. Now, it's unfortunate that this whole project was a 2-year project before the COVID started. And I remember starting it in somewhere in 2019. And in 2022, when almost everything was done, around March, and I submitted the final manuscript, Sir fell ill, Professor Bhattacharya. And after that, he was going and coming out from the nursing home and all, and he was waiting for the book to come out. And I couldn't show him the book. He passed away in June 3rd, 2022, and the book came out somewhere in October. So that's one of the pain that I have, that I'm carrying with me, that I couldn't show him the book. Anyway, he would have been happy to see this book come out. And then, so this was the international edition, the left one. And then Routledge was kind enough to tell me that they are also bringing a South Asian edition, and that came out somewhere in June, I think, this year. So I thought that perhaps it is a good time, 1 year of Professor Bhattacharya's death, and the coming out of the book in his honor in South Asia, to commemorate this volume, and to have academicians in Delhi and who have contributed for the book here together. So just the details about the book. The book is in 4 themes: environment, ecology and development, economics of nature conservation, climate change and development, economics of environmental policy. And we have almost equal chapters under all these 4 themes. So altogether there are 15 chapters in total. And the foreword has been written by Sir Partho Dasgupta. So I'll just, 2 lines I'll quote from him. It's a very good foreword that he had written. And in fact, he was at that time doing the work on biodiversity under the British government. He had brought out a big report on biodiversity. So these are the 2 words, sentences that I thought I should share. He says that in no other context does the interplay of the macro and micro receive as much attention. And yet, whereas farmers, fishermen, woodlanders, and grazers run their eyes constantly on their natural capital assets, the one class of assets that is conspicuously missing in academic writings and government publications on poverty is the wide range of ecosystems and their services that constitute the biosphere. So he was talking about the biodiversity and the ecosystem services. And he says, but with very few exceptions, mainstream economists have followed the early framing of the problem of economic development in terms of the accumulation and distribution of produced capital and human capital. Textbooks and trade books on absolute poverty make little mention that rural households in South Asia and Africa are deeply embedded in their local environmental resource base. The absence of nature in the writings on poverty by economists raised in South Asia is a striking illustration of professional concerns eliding over even casual observation. So this is a part of the foreword of Partha Dasgupta. And to go up a little bit with the author details, there have been 34 authors who have contributed to the volume. And there are authors from India, Professor Murthy, Professor Kanchan Chopra, a very senior scholar, Professor E. Somanathan, sorry for that typo, from ISI Delhi, Professor Ramprasad Sengupta from JNU, Professor Jyoti Parikh. And then we had some authors who are outside the country and who are doing work on environment. Pushpam Kumar is in the UNEP, Ujjain Chakravarti from Tufts University, and then David Simpson from American University, Gregorius Amaker, who is a very famous forest economist from Virginia Tech, Shushmita Dasgupta and David Wheeler from the World Bank, Anil Markandia from Basque, Spain, along with the people from the World Bank, Mani Nepal, who is the director of now Sandy and ICI Mod, Priya Shamsundar from Nature Conservancy, and Bhim Odhikari from IDRC Canada. So these are all, some of the well-known people in environmental economics across the globe, and I'm grateful that all of them have contributed to the volume. So I'll not go into too much of the details of the characteristics of the chapters. It's just that these chapters mostly talk about issues relating to environment. And one big important part of this book is the impact of COVID-19. There are 3 to 4 chapters on the impact. One chapter by Pushpam Kumar titled Natural Capital, Pandemic and Development, Exploration of Nexus and Solutions, talks about the nexus between the pandemic and development and how natural capital is exploited for this kind of development that is leading to the pandemic. It's a very big and interesting chapter. And Professor Sengupta and Chaitanya Chaudhary, they talk about the Malthusian event. They are thinking of a neo-Malthusian crisis. And they are also talking about the nexus, the links between ecology and the environment and development. And there's an interesting chapter by Jyoti Parikh on climate change relating to the pandemic and how that is leading to people to think about sustainable development. So these are some of the very interesting chapters showing the impact of COVID-19. And Professor Bhattacharya, in fact, had done a paper with Snyder on forestry. He was he was known for forest economics, and his work is mainly on forest economics. So we have one section on the economics of nature conservation, where we have a chapter by E. Somanathan on the incentive-based approaches to nature conservation. And then David Simpson has written about the carbon sequestration and ecosystem services. And then we have a very interesting chapter on the incentives for rural households to establish tree cover by Stella Scones, Gregory Amaker, and others. So this is a very empirical chapter. They have done some experiments in Andhra Pradesh on the farmers in the east and west Godavari region. And then there's also another interesting chapter by Shushmita Dasgupta and David Wheeler, where they look into the construction of roads inside the forests. And they have taken 3 countries, one from Latin America, Bolivia, Cameroon from Africa, and Myanmar from Asia, and they look into how these forest regions would be damaged due to the road construction. So, so these are some of the interesting chapters on forestry. And then there are 2 chapters on climate change and development, regional climate vulnerabilities in South Asia. It's an important chapter on what are the probable kind of vulnerabilities that South Asia will face in the future, by Anil Markandia and other authors. And I have a chapter on the climate smart agriculture in developing economies. And I also already mentioned Jyoti Parikh's paper. So then the other interesting area is the economics of environmental policy. And here I would like to mention especially Professor Kanchan Chopra's paper, Environmental Policy in India, Retrospect and Recent Developments, where she actually looks historically at the environmental policy in India after independence and how that policy has been degraded over time, especially after the liberalization and under the new regime now. Then there's a paper by Mani Nepal and others on household waste management and the role of gender. And he has shown that gender is very important when it comes to household waste management. Females are much used to this waste management as compared to males. And then there is another chapter, again an empirical chapter from Priya Shamsundar and his team on the electric fencing of the farmers' protection in Bhutan and how that is affecting the wildlife in Bhutan. So these three are very interesting chapters on the forest and forest habitation. The last chapter is a little different. It's on the regional environmental networks. So here there are people from, I think, INSEE and Sandy also. This Bhim Adhikari and Lavin Hill, they look at the 4 networking organizations across Asia on the environmental economics networks, and Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So they talk about how these networks have helped in the knowledge creation and in the development of environment as a subject across these developing countries. So that's a kind of, in a nutshell, the book as a whole. And I will quote from Dasgupta and Mellor in 1991 when they say that a feasible concept of sustainable development should accommodate both political and ecological concerns. In practice, this will involve the achievement of a socially necessary growth rate for developing countries while at the same time supporting environmental protection and improvement in the future. And the same thing I find in Tagore, from where I come. I teach at Vishwabharati, and there I quote from Tagore himself, "The highest education is that which does not merely give us information, but makes our life in harmony with all existence." So with this, I will stop here. I'll just thank you once again for coming here, and I hope that we remember the work of Professor Bhattacharya and as we go along. Thank you very much.
Climate change is real, and though I'm not from environmental economics, I think at this point all economists should start getting concerned about environment and policy changes. And obviously what we have as a part of policy within the capitalist framework is not working. And we can already see a lot of unprecedented events happen in front of our eyes. The COVID-19 epidemic, the floods, the hurricanes that have been happening all over the US, the forest fires, everything is indicative of the fact that it's not, it's probably the calm before the storm, and the storm awaits us if we don't do something really fast and really soon. And that's why I thank all those people here who have put in an effort in making people understand how this is an extremely important topic that needs to be discussed now. It's not growth versus environment, it's growth and environment. If environment fails, then growth doesn't happen in the long run. It'll only be a short run growth, and development goals will not be achieved if we do not look at this aspect of economics, actually, and politics. So I will, we will begin the panel discussion. We'll begin with I invite the Routledge person from Taylor and Francis Routledge. Shatakshi Mishra. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Hi. Shatakshi, please tell us something about the book.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Basu. I'm so happy to be part of this book launch, and just to share about Taylor and Francis and Routledge. We have been into academic publishing from last so many years, and in 2023 we are celebrating 25 years of TNF India operations. In these years we got to publish the highly qualitative and accomplished work of our authors, and we hope that in coming years we get to do that as well. In last 2.5 years, we as a society has gone through the monumental changes because of the pandemic, and we have learned a lot about it, more about sustainability and the inclusive approach. In last 1 year, TNF have published a lot of titles which is trying to explore the impact of the COVID-19 on the world and our Indian society as well. This book, Environmental Economics in Developing Countries by Dr. Acharya, is one of the few texts who tries to analyze the impact of the environmental challenges in the post-COVID-19 world. It includes the case studies from South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and try to assess the impact of the economic development on the environment, economy, and ecology of these regions. The book tried to steer the conversation towards more nature conservation policies to reduce the impact of the ecological damage which is being done by the economic development. We hope it's a highly accomplished work for the global south, and it raises the need for the strong leadership which is being trained in the environmental and the economical challenges to frame the policies for the upcoming years to be more sustainable and inclusive society. It highlights the importance of the environmental economics in the framing of the policies for the sustainable future. And we as a publisher hope that this book lands to the vast number of the people to initiate the conversation towards more sustainability and the inclusive society. Thank you.
Let us formally launch the book now. Congratulations, Achiransu and Professor Murthy.
No,
I request all our panelists, speakers to launch the book.
Her hand is.
Can we have a round of applause, please? Congratulations, Achiransu, and to all the contributors.
Thank you.
Professor Purnamita Dasgupta. Purnamita Dasgupta is Chair, Professor and Head, Environmental Economics Unit, Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. Her research focuses on the relationship between environment and economic development. She has been visiting professor at University of Cambridge, UK, and Johns Hopkins University, USA. Her recent research includes modeling socioeconomic scenarios for India's national communications and GHG emissions for nationally determined contributions, choice experiments for transition to clean energy use, and economic evaluations of climate change, impacts, and adaptation. She actively engages in public discussions on the environment. May I welcome you, ma'am, to please come to the, and please present your speech.
Thank you very much. I feel truly humbled to be here. I had the privilege of first meeting Professor Bhattacharya in 1994 when I was just about starting my PhD, and on and off thereafter over the next 30 years or so. A much revered scholar and teacher. I was thinking about him this morning, and I thought we could say that he would probably have had innumerable followers, to use the social media lingo of today's day. But what distinguished him from other pioneers in this subject of environmental economics in this country, and he was definitely one of the pioneers, was his unique ability to convey fundamentals in uncomplicated, easy, and seemingly effortless ways, with that very calm composure, which I admired. It actually was a mark of his superb command of the subject. Humble in demeanor, profound in intellectual depth, his genuineness and helpful nature was such that I have never approached him for taking a lecture or giving a talk and been refused, if he was available and if his health permitted. He never said no to me. As I look at this book, I am excited to read Professor Parthadas Gupta's foreword. It's erudite, honest, and beautifully articulated, as Partha always does. I also see names of friends, co-authors, my mentors, and my teachers, many of who have helped me walk on this environmental economics journey. I'm also a bit sad, however, because it is obvious that the journey for this book in particular started with a certain plan. But as the jacket of the book, as you look at it, it reminds us, destiny takes over. I congratulate and compliment Dr. Achiransu Acharyya for giving shape and form to this final contribution from Professor Bhattacharya on the subject of environmental economics. And that is, for me, the major kind of testimonial that we have in front of us today. Dr. Acharya, you have already described the book to some extent, but I'm tempted to put in my little bit of perspective. Please. And at the risk of sounding repetitive, with your permission, I will do so. So as you've heard, this book has 4 sections. But like all edited volumes, apart from this really impressive who's who of environmental economics on the contents page, like any other edited volume, when I opened it, I tried to understand first the rationale of the 4 parts that we see there. And at one level, I understand that, of course, it would meet all expectations because, you're often, as an editor, trying to put together very varied sorts of contributions, each very important in its own way. But I must say that you've done a reasonably, what would I say, very good work, not even reasonably good, but very good work in putting together this kind of conglomeration of articles. So my take on it was that, I saw the first part and the 4th part as being more aligned. And for me, the first part sets the stage for understanding a diversity of perspectives on the nature of the relationship between nature and human society, of course, predominantly from an economist perspective. I see the excellent contributions by Professor Ramprasad Sengupta, Dr. Pushpam Kumar, and their respective co-authors on one hand. And on the other hand, I see Professor Murthy's exploration of neoclassical and plus framings. That's the way I would describe it. And Professor Murthy has walked many of us through the neoclassical framings of the environment as understood by economists. And somewhere in the midst of that, you managed to fit in an empirical contribution on household electrification from Chakravarti and Pelly. The part that I really sort of focused on first when I picked it up was part 2. Professor Bhattacharya's stellar contribution and interests in the economics of forestry are well known. And part 2 is really a fitting testimonial to those credentials. Somanathan, Dasgupta, Scone, Simpson, and their co-authors, they really compete with each other in the way they present their work, lucid, insightful, and focused. And what I liked truly about these chapters was, they do not ignore interdisciplinarity, but they do not also overstate it. And that's a difficult call, often for many of us, when we have a word limit to adhere to. But I think this section just does a fantastic job, all the contributors. When I come to part 3, so this is a mix of overarching perspectives, mingled with specific sectoral examples, all focused on climate change in a development setting. And the contributors, of course, are very well known for their work. Professor Markandeya, Jyoti Parekh, yourself, and all their co-authors. And it's quite a range from the mitigation details that Jyoti gets into to yours on climate smart agriculture. What stood out for me as blending into the overall narrative, which part 1 really set out for me, was the Professor Markandeya's paper on building this narrative on impacts, vulnerability, and coping concerns. And I'll come back to why I see the link between them. Then I come to part 4, where you have a mix of essays and analytical writings, traversing really a range of topics. Of course, policy from the perspective of primarily economists, which is in itself a perfectly reasonable way of going about things given the title of the book. 2 papers in particular that impressed me were Professor Kanchan Chopra's chapter on the evolution of environmental policies and Bhim Adhikari and Dr. Hill's examination of the regional environmental economics networks, particularly because also of Professor Bhattacharya's contributions to SANDI and INSEE. Those were really remarkable, all his teaching contributions. And then, of course, there are very important micro issues such as household waste management by Dr. Mani Nepal and his co-authors, and on electric fencing. But what's it that hangs it together for me? So discussions on environmental economics and books written on these often are treated and we economists tend to be seen as people who work in some kind of a bubble, particularly by others who work on environmental issues. I can see Ashim smiling.
I'm an economist.
But, so I hope you agree with me. Right, okay, great. But that's it. We should not spur a tragedy of the rare. We hope to be part of the mainstream dialogue on environment, and this is where I see this book sort of giving me hope, particularly in the chapters by certain doyens and pioneers who not only raise concerns and flag challenges, but also shine a torch. And here I would, and this is where part 1 and part 4 and 1 or 2 chapters in the other parts come together for me, starting with Pushpam Kumar's Nexus and Solutions perspective. Because it's a nexus approach, which actually will tell us that it's not the balance between economic development and nature anymore. For me, it is nature is development. When we can get to that stage as economists to think that nature is part of development, I think then we will see nature and food security, nature and water security, nature and human health and well-being in whatever way we see it. So I think for South Asia, these are papers which really sort of help us push the agenda. Pushpam Kumar's Nexus and Solutions perspective, Professor Ramprasad Sengupta's scope flagging the scope for course correction towards a more improved socioeconomic system, Kanchan Chopra's focus on shared values and institutions, and Professor Markandeya's call for climate finance and resilience for development of South Asia. Finally, a lot has been covered, but I have my own pet topics, of course, that I would look for in a book like this, so I can't resist saying that it would be lovely to have also seen, but I know you can only do so much in one book, but it would have been lovely to see something more on aspects like transboundary sharing and management of our commons, our resources, both across state boundaries within India and across national boundaries in the region. Pollution as one growing concern, for instance, and resource scarcities. So I would say, I'm sure this book will do its bit for the nexus, for showing us the way forward. Once again, congratulations for giving us this opportunity to pay our homage to Professor Rabindranath Bhattacharya. I just wish he could have been here and contribute his name to the cover of this, to the jacket as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Purnamita Dasgupta. We have Professor Shrikant Gupta with us here today. Shrikant Gupta is Professor at the Department of Economics, Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University. He has worked as a policy maker and researcher in areas spanning environment, urban policy, and economics. He was past president of the Indian Society for Ecological Economics. He has taught at the universities of Delhi, Maryland, JNU, and NUS. His teaching and research interests are in applied economics and policy, including environment and development, climate change, econometrics, public economics, and microeconomics. He has served on several national and international committees, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, to which his contribution was recognized. I invite you, sir, to come to the podium. And or you want to speak from here?
Yeah, I can make my comments from here.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess we have plenty of time since we are filling in for several people. I'm also delighted that now I have 2 copies of this book. Achiransu was so nice to autograph a copy for me, so I have a second copy which will occupy pride of place at the Ratan Tata Library at the Delhi School of Economics. And I think the biggest homage I can pay to Robida is to use it in my course, which I certainly will. Lots of these chapters are going to form part of my reading list, so it will be an enduring legacy in his memory. I am actually deeply honored to be part of this event, and I'm not Das Gupta, I'm simply Gupta here, so, so I'm just half of Das Gupta here. Robida, I would like to call him as Robida. I unfortunately only met him a couple of times, but his reputation as a formidable teacher preceded him, and I met him a couple of times at the Sandy workshops, and he was indeed, I mean, to me, he's like the K.L. Krishna, if you know of Professor K.L. Krishna at the Delhi School of Economics, tremendously modest person who has mentored generations of scholars, and I think of Robida as the similar person, started off with some very important academic contributions, but also a great mentor, a phenomenal teacher, and above all, a very modest and humble person. And I think that is something we should really learn from him. There were no airs about him, so I think that is a true inspiration for us. I really compliment Dr. Acharya for this labor of love, and I think that is his Guru Dakshina, the Guru Dakshina as we say. And I'm reminded of this famous couplet of Kabir, गुरु गोबिंद दो खड़े काके लागू पाए, बलिहारी गुरु आपने गोबिंद दियो बताए. So, I think we all know this, but if God and Guru are standing in front of me, whose feet should I touch? I should touch my Guru's feet because of the fact that he's the one who showed me the path. And I think if I could remember the one person who influenced me as a scholar, as a teacher, it was my high school economics teacher, who's obviously no more. So I think the role of a guru is really, really significant in our lives, and in that sense, this Guru Dokkhina by Achiransu and this collective homage in terms of all these stalwarts who have contributed to this book is truly magnificent. I know editing a book is not easy. Perhaps writing a book is easier than editing a book, because in editing a book, you really have to herd people together. And as Asim would know, a common friend, Anand Swami, has just co-edited this massive volume called The Cambridge Economic History of Modern South Asia, where I unfortunately was a laggard contributor. And Anand said, Shrikant, editing a book is like herding cats, and it's really challenging. And I must confess that I missed out on the opportunity to contribute to this volume. And actually, it's just as well, because as I was looking through the people who've contributed, this is a veritable who's who of economists. Most of us know these names. So it's just as well that I'm not in this distinguished company. And I'm not a part of this galaxy of luminaries, rightly so. And I will simply discharge here the more mundane part, but somewhat presumptuous task of commenting on some of these chapters, if I may be bold enough to do that. And hopefully I can also make amends by perhaps writing a book review if that opportunity arises. And as Purnamita was saying, or as Achiransu was reading out that preface from Sir Partha Dasgupta, as some of you know, Dasgupta and Mailer have been plowing this sort of lonely furrow where they've been talking about the centrality of nature to economics. And even today, that sort of has not really permeated. And if we really think of the prominent names amongst economists from South Asia, two of whom are Nobel laureates, so one doesn't need to name them, I think there's a real poverty in their poverty of economics. So when they're reading about, Sir Partha Dasgupta has been talking about it, those of you who know, and Achiransu has already read out a couple of sentences from his preface, and I will simply remind you of that one sentence that I think all of us should read, which is the absence of nature in the writings on poverty by economists. So there's no surprise who he's hinting at. By economists raised in South Asia, so no more hints required, is a striking illustration of the professional concerns eliding over even casual observation. Of course, he has very beautiful prose, so eliding means omitting. I just checked up in the dictionary. So I think that, jokes apart, this is very serious. If we think of development, we think of poverty, and we don't talk about nature, I think that's a huge problem. And I think, again, here we are preaching to the choir because several people here work on environment and development, but I think that point that Partha is making is extremely important. My task, as I was told, was to basically comment on a fifth of this book, which is the climate change part. So it's about 70 pages of this about roughly 350-page book. My task is made easier for two reasons. One, that for the last 15 years or so, I've been working on climate change. I've been part of IPCC along with Purnamita. My role in the Nobel Prize was actually very limited. There were about 800 or odd people who were contributing, and lots of economists and social scientists and other scientists. So I've been working in this area, so obviously my task was made easier in terms of commenting, and of course all of the people who have written these chapters, I'm very familiar with their work and with them personally. My task is also made easier by the fact that all these three chapters are very clean and concise and relatively brief. But and this compared to some of the more theoretical and empirical papers in this volume, which are equally important and interesting. But do not be fooled by the sort of the conciseness or the brevity of these 3 chapters. These are extremely important chapters, and as was mentioned earlier, and I don't think that in this room we need to tell ourselves about the problem about climate change. I think this is the most existential threat facing humankind. And one thing, since I just finished teaching a course on climate economics, is that, you know, in economics we talk about these discounting the future and thinking about the long run. So I was just thinking that everything that I've been teaching is actually wrong. It's actually false, because I've been teaching students about, oh, the costs of abatement are now and the damages averted are in the future. So how do you balance this? And we go through all these arcane things like the discounting and the Ramsey rule and the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. And I was thinking, all this is wrong. Why is this wrong? Can somebody tell me? Any guess? Exactly, that's exactly the point, that, you know, if anybody is reading the newspapers and the news or even experiencing, it's not a problem in the future. So, I mean, I don't even know how to react to all of this as an economist, having been brought into this intertemporal and, you know, the Ramsey infinitely lived individuals. I mean, it's really worrying. It's really worrying that climate change is really happening as we talk about it. So in any event, it is a very important existential threat. I don't even know if there is something that we can do about it now. I mean, if runaway climate change is happening, if the oceans are warming to the point that the Western Antarctic ice shelf will collapse, if the thermohaline circulation will stop, if we're going to have this extreme weather events happening not once in 100 years, but every other year, if we're going to have these massive heat waves, and at the same time our emissions of greenhouse gases continue to increase, there is no sign of them peaking. Our own country, rightly or wrongly, has said that we will not reach net zero before 2070. Then the question is it game over? Is this just something that we economists, you know, to quote this analogy from the Titanic, you know, we are like people who are arguing about the order of the deck chairs on the Titanic while it's racing towards an iceberg. So these are very important questions that we really need to think about. Be that as it may, if you permit me, I can briefly talk about the 3 chapters. I must confess that I only got this book 10 days ago, and I have not obviously read all the chapters. I have read these 3 chapters extremely carefully. So I may want to subject you to those 3 chapters, but not obviously a line-by-line summary. But I think these 3 chapters that I was tasked to read and somewhat, as I said, presumptuously comment on. The first chapter is by good friends Anil Markandia, Muthukumara Mani, and 2 other of their colleagues. And this chapter is on regional climate vulnerabilities in South Asia. So these are very relevant for us as we sit in this room. And of course, there's no rocket science in this chapter in this sense. So just to tell you very quickly, what is it that they are talking about? Well, firstly, there is this whole discussion about what the future climate will look like in our country. And like I've already said, it's not now future climate. Let's see what's the current climate. And again, all of us are experiencing it. For example, extreme weather events. That's just a fancy way of saying things like a greater frequency of floods, droughts, cyclones, landslides, and all of these are not something that are going to happen in future. They're happening now. The problem with scientists and to some extent economists is this whole notion of attribution. So it's like saying, okay, well, the waters of the oceans are warming up, so the frequency of cyclones is going up, but how do we know for sure? Maybe it's something else, you know? So the point is, by the time you try to join the dots, the Titanic has already crashed into the iceberg. So we are having these frequent extreme weather events. and in Delhi, we also saw some of these. We've also, the data tells us that we are into a warmer and wetter world. But a wetter world is not always a good thing, because there's going to be a lot of intertemporal and spatial variation. So we can have long periods of spells without monsoons, and then suddenly very heavy deluges. We saw that happening in Delhi, but that was happening all the way from Korea to the northern hemisphere. So the Markandeya et al. Really basically talk about that, but then, I mean, I'll just very quickly tell you, they say 5 major impacts of climate change as far as South Asia is concerned. Again, no rocket science. One is the impact on agriculture, and so that's a very nice segue into Achiransu's chapter on climate smart agriculture. The second, they're talking about floods and sea level rise, so how it's going to impact our coastal areas. The third impact that they talk about is the health effects of heat waves and their impact on human productivity. The fourth impact they talk about is migrations within countries and across countries in the South Asia region. And this is what we could call sort of the climate refugees. And finally, they talk about the impact of climate change on cities. Now, obviously, there can be many more impacts, but I do think that this is a remarkable chapter because it's picked up on these 5 very important aspects where it's going to impact particularly us in South Asia. They've also in this chapter talked about ameliorative measures, because like I told you, mitigation, yes, but if the game is over in terms of runaway climate change, then what can we do? Well, we need to adapt. And so there again, the second chapter on climate smart agriculture becomes very important. So Markandeya et al. Have talked about a few things and not talked about a few other things, but again, that's limitations of space. And so just to flag for you a couple of things that they talk about, which I think are really important, and again, no rocket science here, is major investments in water storage, because if you're going to have all these intertemporal fluctuations, then you need more investment in water storage. How that will happen, the devil lies in the details, because we also know that building dams and so on is not really a great option anymore. But they do talk about infrastructure for flood protection. They talk about climate proofing our cities, and a number of very interesting points that they are making. What I also found very interesting and something that really resonates with us is that what are we doing about all this? There's a lot of hype about climate mitigation. We read a lot about renewables. We're reading a lot about solar energy in our country. But in the current sort of political climate, it's very hard to distinguish the hype from the reality. And I really don't want to get into all the details here, but I think what is one thing that people who work on climate understand very well is the weakness of our institutional framework. Right now, climate policy is largely driven through the Prime Minister's office and is largely focused on mitigation, and that too largely in terms of renewables. There used to be a national action plan on climate change in our country, and I say used to be because it was set up more than 10 years ago by the previous government, and it really is more or less defunct. Climate policy is being driven mostly by the line ministry, which is the Ministry of Environment, and this is, I'm basically just telling you what this chapter is saying, so these are not my thoughts, so please don't come after me for saying all this. And they basically are really saying that these line ministries like the Ministry of Environment have a strong scientific and regulatory orientation. And of course, now with the dilution of the forest bill, you really wonder about the regulatory orientation. But nonetheless, the point that they're trying to make in terms of the very important discussion on the institutional framework is the lack of it. The lack of some sort of a supra body which transcends ministerial silos and then translates some of these highfalutin talks into action. So I think that is another very important contribution. Moving very quickly on to Dr. Acharya's chapter is climate smart agriculture. Agriculture, some of us, at least economists, say, oh, well, agriculture, it's only 25% of a GDP. But we all know that even now about 60% of our population is rural. We know that about half our workforce is in agriculture. We know that agriculture still drives our economic growth. We know that a poor agricultural year can take off as much as 1% of our GDP. These are all well-known facts. So climate smart agriculture essentially is about how we climate proof our agriculture. And that, I think, is a very, very important chapter. If I'm not to flatter you, Achiransu, but if I were to think of one chapter that's really significant in this book, it is that chapter. And climate smart agriculture essentially combines adaptation, mitigation, and food security. So I think that is an extremely important chapter. I don't want to again go through everything, but I think Jyoti Parekh's chapter on pandemic and climate change is important. She says it's a double-edged sword. Some of the things that happened in the pandemic in terms of greater, virtual meetings and reducing our carbon footprints through internet and mobile has been a good thing. Delhi, for example, we all know we saw blue skies. Sitting trapped in our homes, we were saying, oh, well, the skies are blue and the wildlife is back. So that was there, of course, but I think it's all back to business as usual. I mean, whether it's our health systems, has the pandemic left a long-lasting impact? I don't know. But what she's saying in her chapter is that there were these unintended benefits of the pandemic. And to be fair, some of them are long-lasting. We do a lot more meetings virtually. So when you have to talk, you don't have to walk, right? Then, of course, she says that the pandemic also has not been very good because we're ordering a lot of stuff and creating a lot of waste. She doesn't provide much evidence for it, but yes, I guess, there have been certain downsides of the pandemic. Particularly, she's flagging this whole issue of medical waste, all those discarded masks and PPE suits and those sorts of things. So these three chapters are forming a very nice sort of a complement. So that's essentially my take on the book. And if you allow me, I'm going to make a few parting comments on what we are trying to do as economists here. And my concluding thoughts here are that, if you look at the sort of the recent depredations of nature in our country, I mean, whether it is this Great Nicobar project, which seems to be going full steam ahead, whether you think of this multi-laning of these roads in the Himalayas, the infamous Char Dham project, where, of course, nature is now coming back at us. If you look at the current dilution of the Forest Act, which is making its way through Parliament, I mean, I was thinking about it, I'm fairly old. I have many more yesterdays than tomorrows. And I was really wondering, are we scholars, we have, frankly, we have failed to change the course of the policy discourse. And today, are we sitting in an echo chamber? Am I just writing my papers? Am I really making a difference? Because if you really think about it, the environment is in trouble, and lots of these things are happening in the real world that we have not been able to influence. So that's a very sort of a existential question that at least I have been asking myself a lot more now. And I'm reminded, Mrs. Gandhi once came to the Institute of Economic Growth for its Silver Jubilee. That was decades ago, obviously. And she said something which very interesting. She said, India has produced more economists than economic growth. It was at that point in time. So, I mean, and so then what's the role of this book? What's the role of economists? What's the role of intellectuals who are working in academia? Should we just abandon all this? My answer is certainly no. I think we should pursue knowledge. Knowledge creation is extremely important. And I'm telling this as much to you as to myself, that doing this kind of research is extremely important because we are adding to the corpus of knowledge, which is the basis for action. So just a couple of closing remarks there, that we must redouble our efforts, but we must also continue engaging with policy. And to my mind, people like Sharad Lele are really impressive because they combine, well, there's Sharad, there is Deepak Malghan, there are several others who are combining scholarship with activism. So Sharad wrote a brilliant article in the Indian Express on the Forest Act, and I think that's something that we all should read. So I think, in my view, academics must continue pursuit of knowledge. As Tennyson said, as some of you will remember, well, Sharmila is here, an English professor. What was that famous one? To pursue knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought. That's the one in Ulysses, I think, right? So to pursue knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought. I myself, to end on a personal note, you know, we in the Delhi School of Economics, we are about to cut down something like 120 trees of 18 different species with ages ranging from 15 to 160 years because we need office space. So I've been trying to be active in that and in a very constructive way try to quantify the value of these trees in terms of the carbon sequestered, the ecosystem services. I've spotted brown-headed barbets, gray hornbills, building nests in these trees. The university in the Times of India story said, well, there are vacant spaces in the Delhi School of Economics where 2 8-storied buildings will come up and each one of them will cost 100 crores for which we have taken a loan. So I was just wondering that, are these vacant spaces? Can I try to value them and try to influence the discourse? So I'll end with that comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your speech, Professor Gupta. It reminds me that when you talk about climate change like that, it reminds me of this conversation. I teach at Kamla Nehru College, and Professor Amrajit Singh from Oxford had come. And he mentioned about a book. I can't remember the author's name. He said that the author says in that book that climate change is so imminent and it's going to happen. And one of the ways to adapt to it, and it was shocking for me, was that to get used to grief. Because we are going to lose brothers, sisters, family members, and so we become spiritual. That's the only thing we can do. So it was very extremely morose and extremely extreme for me. I lighten up the environment, the whole atmosphere with another thing that was brought to my mind by a speech when you talked about the Delhi skies and how blue it had become during the pandemic. And there were all these people saying, oh, we can see the Qutub Minar, we can see the Lotus Temple, we can see the Himalayas, it's so blue. So then there were memes which were saying the Delhi skies are so clear that our husbands can see our point of view. So those were horrible times, but that was the one thing that was there. The skies were blue, and I hope we don't need a pandemic for that anymore, and we could have it someday. So our next speaker is Professor Aseem Srivastava. Aseem Srivastava is a Delhi-based writer and economist. He wrote his doctoral thesis in environmental economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He has taught economics for many years at college and university level in India and the US. Most recently, he taught philosophy at Nordic College, Norway. He's a former professor at Ashoka University. He has written extensively on issues associated with globalization. He's the author of Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India, published from Penguin, India in 2012. You can please, Professor Srivastava, you want to come to the podium or you'll speak from there? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Basu, for a more than generous and inadvertently inaccurate introduction. I've never been sorry, am I audible at the back? I've never been a professor. I don't know if I should be proud of that or ashamed of it, but that's the truth. I was visiting faculty at Ashoka University till last year. I have left Ashoka University subsequently, and I'm co-author, not the only author, of Churning the Earth with Ashish Kothari, who actually was the main inspiration for the book. Thank you, Achiransu, for giving me this opportunity yet again to repeat my spiel. Achiransu has heard me in Kolkata some years ago. On that occasion, Robida was there at Suhas Da's house. Suhas Roy is a close friend in Kolkata, and he was kind enough to organize a talk of mine at his house, and Robida was one of the people present. That was one of the few occasions I got to see the man himself, and the greatness of a human being is the accessibility and humility of the person, and it was quite palpable. We will miss him for all the reasons that have already been recounted. I'm also missing Professor Murthy, actually, because he was my first teacher of economics. I don't know if you know that he used to teach at Hindu College. And I was a student from 1980 to 83 at Hindu College. And it was Professor M.N. Murthy who was teaching us mathematical methods and statistics, an excellent teacher. So I was looking forward to listening to him, and I haven't had time to look at his complex model in the book. I have to first confess that I have not read the book. Simply not had time. Unlike many other people, God has only given me 2 eyes and weak ones. I have read Sir Parthadas Gupta's foreword. I have read your preface and browsed your introduction, Achiransu, as well as your Climate Smart Agriculture chapter, which I agree with Shrikant is actually, in my extreme ignorance, one of the best highlights of the book. It is appetizing. After a long time, I have come across a book of economics I actually want to keep on my shelf without shame and access from time to time. There's a lot of economics books in my shelf which I wouldn't wish upon my enemies, let alone upon my students. So those, I don't know what worth they are. Maybe in a cold winter in Ramgarh, where I spend part of my year, I'll use them as, firewood or something like that, return it to the earth, because they should never have been written, some of them. This is not to be pompous or arrogant. I think my economist colleagues on the podium will actually second some of my choices. This book is impressive, and I'm not saying it only to flatter present company. I think it's an excellent handbook, as they used to be called once upon a time, of environmental economics, not only in developing countries. I would like to amend the second part of it, and I have something to say on this later on this evening. I think people in the first world need to read this. The first world is the big missing element, actually, and I'll develop this a little later. It's a much needed and an appropriate book in the honor of the stature of a man like Robida. I think non-economists who can read parts of it should. I mean, for instance, Parthadas Gupta's 3 or 4 page introduction is fabulous. I just read it this morning, and I read the whole paragraph to my mother, and she could follow every word. Now, that's not something you can say of most economists' writings, right? I was very proud that my mother read my PhD thesis and actually understood it 27 years ago. 400 pages of, non-economics from an economics department. It's impressive, and I think it was Shrikant who was talking about how the editor has such a hard time putting a book like this together. What was that? To what they need to think about and what they need to do, and show the way through concrete action. This is, also true of film stars. Anybody who takes jet rides around the planet, basically. My passport expires this month, and my American visa, 10 years old, also expires. I was told 6 months ago that if you have a valid passport, then you don't need to apply for a fresh American visa if you have a 10-year American visa. It gets automatically renewed. One part of me was very elated that I won't have to stand in those ugly queues again. The other part of me felt a bit sad because I realized I actually don't want to travel now outside India. And the best way for me to not have to think about this issue of the American visa, where I have so many friends in the US and so many relatives I would like to see, some of them aging aunts and uncles who I'd like to see, I said the best way would be if I actually don't renew my passport. Problem solved. So 23rd August, I am a liberated man. I am a man without a passport. The quantitative pieces in the book, I think there are two or three pieces in the book which are quantitatively demanding, which I think you might want to flag it for the lay reader, because the lay reader can actually follow a lot of the rest of the book, but those chapters would be difficult for them. And I think the rest of the book has so much content that is relevant to non-economists. I think this book deserves a commercial edition without the technical bits. So that is something to consider, given the significance of the issue and given the amount of work that Achiransu and others and Rutledge have put into it. I think you should seriously think of a commercial edition which would be more accessible and more in plain English than in economies. I think it was Santayana, Ashish Da is sitting here, he'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was the philosopher George Santayana who said that life is the art of making sufficient inferences from insufficient premises. I may be paraphrasing a little. Economists do the opposite. They assume the universe and then they say, see, we were right. Okay, so economists will, get into technicalities, try to work backwards from the desired conclusion as to what assumptions we need in order to generate that conclusion. They call it science, right? So, there's a lot of technicalities in economics, a lot of esoterica, which is not even worth the while of most economists, let alone non-economists. I'm not saying that that's what this book has in terms of the technical, content of it, but, the Greek letters tend to push readers out, and it might be worthwhile to think of an edition in which even Professor Murthy's piece, for instance, can be communicated in simple English and leave the algebra out of it. By the way, I don't want to open this on principle, but my mouth is dry, and we have to find an alternative to this. We might have to change the whole world in order to find an alternative to this, and let's work for that. One comment on an excellent piece, from what I could tell, David Wheeler and Dr. Dasgupta's, on road construction in the book. Road construction is a terrible euphemism for the expressways and freeways and flyways that are now colonizing the globe. And I think it's time we called a thing by its proper name. So for instance, Sagar in Madhya Pradesh, which is my hometown, my father comes from there, used to take about 12 to 14 hours drive once upon a time. Last year, my 100-year-old uncle, my chacha, my Tauji, passed away. And I got the news at 9 a.m. At 11 a.m., I got into the car. At 7 p.m., we were in Sagar. My big learning from that road trip was that India now is proceeding rapidly towards the expressway on non-linear tracks. And once they arrive at the expressway, the villagers, they are selling off their lands and creating restaurants, hotels. Thank you so much. Restaurants, hotels, even spas and gyms on the expressway. You drive from Jhansi to Sagar, you see those things. I love Malthon, I love Jhansi. So if America is what we were setting out to build within our bellies, that should have been said in the Constitution. But that's where we are going, that's where we are clearly heading. And a lot of unstated agendas of development since the Truman Doctrine was announced in 1949 are now bearing fruit. And this should be said, regardless of which party is in power. They all have a multi-partisan consensus that we should want to become America. What else is there to dream of? So, it's something which bothers me. If somebody of David Wheeler's caliber and stature is using euphemisms like road construction, it's serious, you know. So this last month, I had to travel to South India, and I had to think, because I don't like air travel, even before and without climate change. I never liked being boxed into that, you know, space with, you know, stale air and all that. But this time, you know, I had so many people to see and so many places to visit and so on. Time was so short. And I put a hand on my heart. I did buy air tickets off my own pocket. 5 flights I think I took in 3 weeks. My learning from this trip was that the city center, whether it was Hyderabad or Chennai or Bangalore, the city center around the world has now moved. And where is it located now? It's the airport lounge. The airport lounge is now the new heart of the city, the new platform, the new takeoff point from where we reach out to the world and the universe. That's the escape. If you have enough escape velocity in your wallet, you will be able to do that. And if that is the heart of the new heart of the city, the expressway that links the city to the airport, or the metro rail that links the airport to the city center, old city center, that is the aorta. And you can sort of build in your mind a map of the new circulatory system of what I call in my book, which I'm working on, The Alphabet of Ecosophy, I call it transnature. Transnature is to be spelt Trance, hyphen nature. And for every transnature, there is an infranature, which is to say a part of the earth which is being despoiled and devastated to enable it to happen, sustain itself, and grow. It's cancerous, but it's not obvious to those who are suffering from the cancer, like so many cancers. So you know, road construction is not the way to, I think, look at this. We are living in a world which is so terribly globalized now that most cultures around the world, including the first world, if not the first world leading it, are thinking parochially and consuming globally. Thinking parochially, consuming globally. You remember the old slogan from the 60s, I think it was Abby Hoffman's slogan, think globally, act locally. So the opposite is going on, and because of the sheer materialization of life and all metaphysical and ethical values, be damned. So, in the context of all this, how much time do I have, Achiransu? Oh, good. 15 minutes is enough to talk about Rabindranath, because after all, one lifetime is not enough to read everything he wrote. We need a different vision altogether. With all due respect to the enormous effort this book embodies and carries, and I think it's a very, very important bridge to the kind of vision that we need. I don't have that vision. I have one spot somewhere, I have some piece somewhere, somebody else, like Shrikant has many spots here and there, but nobody has a complete vision of where we are going, where we should be going, where we should be wanting to go. We don't know those answers. Now that's where you don't need an intellectual. That's where you need a seer. In our language, a drishta, somebody who knows how to see things directly, like a Zen master would say, see directly into the nature of things. Don't overthink, don't intellectualize, don't make a fetish out of thought, right? Thought is a good servant and a terrible master. The question is, what is it a slave or a master of? That's the relevant question. Is it serving power? Is it serving love? What is it serving? So Rabindranath is the person, I think, who has an answer to, or rather has an approach through which answers could be found, solutions could be, invented. Solutions don't drop from a sky. Solutions emerge from a certain philosophy, from a certain approach to life. Rabindranath had those things right. To call him an environmentalist would be dismally uncharitable. To my mind, in my language, he's not only India's, but the modern world's first ecosopher. He's the one who actually understands ecosophy so well that he doesn't need definitions and so on. What is ecosophy? I use the word in the same sense in which the Spanish, or rather Catalan, Keralite philosopher theologian Raimundo Panikkar uses the term ecosophy, the wisdom of the earth in very simple language. The wisdom of the earth as our only home in the vastness of the cosmos. He is careful to say that this is not our wisdom about the earth, for that would be some kind of science. So for instance, ecology is our wisdom about the earth. Ecology is a science. Environmentalism is a technocratic perspective for the most part because it's looking for solutions. It has a solutionist approach and therefore also has a denialism that goes with the solutionism dialectically. So, when Panikkar says that we should be thinking of the wisdom of the earth, he's trying to draw our attention to the fact that none of us asked to be here. I don't mean in this room, but none of us asked to exist. None of us could ever put the earth in motion, either make it rotate or revolve on its, around the sun. The heavens don't move according to some human calculus. They have their own intelligence, whatever that is. What is all that? Birds migrate all over the earth. I taught in Norway for some years, and there used to be these two birds, literally two birds. They were oyster catchers with orange beaks. They would appear in Norway precisely on the spring equinox and depart on the autumn equinox to Equatorial Guinea, where they would spend the winter. We wish humans had that kind of intelligence. So there's clearly an intelligence which belongs to the universe. You don't have to be a believer to believe that. But clearly, even science is trying to reach that intelligence. Quantum physics is trying to understand precisely that intelligence which is autonomous of human will, isn't it? If that was not the case, that invalidates the whole of science, actually. So when Panikkar uses the word ecosophy, the search is for a wisdom which is intrinsic, innate, natural to the cosmos, to the universe, to the earth. Okay. Our own Gayatri mantra, what is that? When you recite it, what are you invoking, or who are you invoking, and what are you asking for? There's a search there. There's a search for our minds to be blessed by a greater intelligence. This is not mysticism, this is reality, folks. And we've been misled into dismissing and putting all these things out of court and out of contention, blindly. So Rabindranath, coming from that sort of a perspective that Panikkar is elucidating philosophically in rigorous terms in books like The Rhythm of Being or Cultural Disarmament, I could name several others, Rabindranath has that so much in his bloodstream that every, song, 2000 odd songs, Rabindra Sangeet, Gitanjali, the poetry, everything breathes that. The poetry read in Bengali, understood, recited in Bengali, has that. Translated into English, it's another thing. But that kind of natural sort of access to one's own nature and to one's own divine nature is there in Rabindranath. So his vision is at once cosmic and spiritual. He is not mystifying things, he's just experiencing things that way, and he's communicating it in language which is very accessible to anyone who knows Bangla or English. I have a lot to say. I won't be able to say all of it, but I'm going to read to you a few things. And I want to draw your attention to one particular concept, which I'm building my book on Rabindranath around. I don't know how many more years I'm going to take on it, but the concept is something which he mentions in a lecture. They are not very different if you look deeper. They also share the name. One happens to be an economist of our times, the other happens to be a poet of another time. And if you will allow me, in fact, I first refused to speak at this talk because Achiransu wanted economists. I said, I'm no longer doing economics. So if you still want me to speak, I'll speak about Tagore's ecosophy insofar as it is relevant to economics. So please bear with me. In a lecture that Rabindranath gives in Sriniketan, the sister village of Shantiniketan, in 1938, it's an Abhibhashan called Aranya Devata. And in that talk, Rabindranath says that Manush, I'm trying to remember the exact Bangla, Manush Prithubir Dan ke Gridnu bhave Prithvir Dan ke grohan koreche. Did I get that right? So, Gridnu bhave. I searched every Bangla dictionary that I could access. What is Gridnu bhav? I did not find the word. I asked a number of Bengali scholars in Kolkata, senior scholars, and I got some hints, but nobody had a clear answer. Then yes, that's correct. So it's actually the Gid is the colloquialization, and Gridhu is the Sanskrit of vulture. The attitude that vultures have towards carrion is the attitude that Rabindranath accuses modern humanity of having towards the natural world. And in that lecture, he says that once upon a time, humanity was born in the forest, and it had towards the forest what he calls momottobodh, the mamata of the mother, that sort of an attitude towards the forest, as well as being mothered by the forest in turn. And that sort of mutualism has now given way to something which he calls nirmam bhav, so mercilessness. You live at a great distance from the forest, you don't even see it in your daily life. Villages at least see the forests in the distance, cities don't even do that. Yeah, the marvelous lecture remains untranslated to this day. I've done my own translation. This thing of Gridnu bhav is actually the anchor concept for my work on Rabindranath. And what I if I was to paraphrase it in English, I would call it a kind of restless hyper desire, a hyper desire which is driven by despair. So you run from despair towards desire, and when your nature rebels against it, then you fall into despair again. And your entire body, mind, spirit, heart, everything falls out of rhythm. It gets, in my language, arrhythmic. Arrhythmia is from cardiology, so that's a metaphor which applies to ecosystems, it applies to human health as much. human body itself as a microbiome is an ecosystem in itself, multiple ecosystems actually. So this Rabindranath says in 1938, and I think, you know, some of his best ideas are actually in the lectures. Other than the poetry and the music, I find that what he says to the Japanese in Japan, what he says to the Chinese in China, what he says to the Americans in America, and what he says to Indians in India. Not what he writes, but what he says. Very, very important. Another lecture, which he gives in 1922, 16 years back, before that, is Robbery of the Soil. And many of you read that lecture. It's actually written for the purpose of setting up Sriniketan with Leonard Elmhurst, his secretary at that time. And there, I'm going to quote now, he says that civilization itself has turned into a vast catering establishment. 100 years ago, when the world population was about 1/4 or 1/5 of its present size, and the size of the global economy was probably 40 or 50 times less than today, Rabindranath is saying the civilization has turned into a vast catering establishment to conduct feasts for a whole population of gluttons, and the price of the intemperance is exacted from entire peoples in Asia and Africa. Right? Those are the kinds of issues, the gentleman has left now, but those are the kinds of issues that Robida is talking about in all his work on groundwater and forests and so many other things. Right? Now, this is my only serious grouse against your book, Achiransu, and that is that it lacks the dimension of international political economy, as though ecological imperialism is passé and is not happening right now. For instance, I looked for a reference to Larry Summers' famous memo. Those of you who know that Summers was chief economic advisor. He was senior economist at the World Bank, one of the most powerful people in the world, still might get a Nobel Prize one of these days. I hope so, because the Nobel Prize deserves him. So, you know, now this guy says that we should go and pollute poor countries because they're underpolluted. It would be far more efficient for them to carry more of the global pollution load, etc., etc. A whole set of logical arguments which are morally outrageous. They are impeccably carved in logic, but they're outrageous in any ethical term. This is 1992, and I was afraid that what he's saying is going to become reality. Now it has become reality. So much so that a book like this doesn't even refer to it. This is worrying. This is very worrying. I will also mention a very, very important article which Shrikant, Achiransu, Ashishta, everybody would know about. Garrett Hardin is mentioned in the book, Garrett Hardin, the biologist, and his famous piece, The Tragedy of the Commons from 1968, is referred to in two places I noticed from the index. But the more important piece is Lifeboat Ethics from 1974. And do you know what this man says in Lifeboat Ethics in 1974? We are not on spaceship Earth. The Earth is a lifeboat. And on a lifeboat, room is very little. Room is very scarce. We need to offload certain people in order to make the boat floatable at all. Otherwise, we are all going to sink. Is it better to save some or is it better to save none in the attempt to save all? That's the kind of logic he offers. Overpopulated world, all that. And so we have to change our ethics, we have to change our attitude to the poor, effectively saying they're dispensable. Yeah. And many of the not so rich are also dispensable. So we are in the crosshairs, and we can't not think about this in global terms. The methodology has to be global. It can't be national or even regional, I argue. I like the last piece for its focus on regionalism, where we talk about regional environmental economics in South Asia. So it has a good South Asia focus, but a lot of World Bank policies also now have a South Asia focus. That's not new. What we need is a global methodology, or rather an earthly methodology, which would actually be as relevant to the white world and the wide world as it is to us. You can't separate countries anymore. Nationalism should have been old hat by now, but it's the obsolescent ideology of our time. There's a lot of other things which are, there in Rabindranath, which I would have liked to speak about. I don't think I have the time. I'm going to close with two quotations, I think. One is from Shobhitar Prati, which is a poem he writes in a collection called Choitali in 1896. And the other is from Chinnopatro, which is from one of the letters he writes to his niece Indira Devi around the same time. So end of the 19th century itself, he is seeing the onset of the seriousness of the ecological crisis. Translation is by Fakhrul Alam. He says, Shobhitar Prati is to civilization. That's what it means. Give back the wilderness, take away the city. Embrace, if you will, your steel, brick, and stone walls, O newfangled civilization. Cruel, all-consuming one, return all sylvan, secluded, shaded, and sacred spots and traditions of innocence. Come back evenings when herds returned suffused in evening light. Serene hymns were sung, paddy accepted as alms, and bark clothes worn. Wrapped in devotion, one meditated on eternal truths, then single-mindedly. No more stone-hearted security or food fit for kings. We'd rather breathe freely and discourse openly. We'd rather get back the strength we once had, burst through all barriers that hem us in, and feel this boundless universe's pulsating heartbeat. So that's the poem I wanted to read to you, and the quotation from Chinnopatro, which is from 1895, a letter to Indira Devi. Rabindranath says, I have a very intense, intimate, real and living relationship with all of nature. And that it is that love and that relationship which I feel is my truest and highest dharma. And that unless you understand this inner character of mine, you will not be able to enjoy, in fact, even understand most of my poetry. This dharma of mine is an everyday dharma. I meditate upon it all the time. Yesterday, there was a mother goat sitting on the grass by the road, serious, relaxed, and calm, with her infant snuggled up against her in a completely dependent and totally relaxed way. The deep, sensuous experience of love and wonder with which my heart filled up on seeing that is what I call my religious discourse. So, my own conclusion, I'll read to you now. By struggling through Ridnubhav himself, as the poems in Gitanjali reveal abundantly, and ultimately showing that it can be transcended, Rabindranath shows that it is possible to arrive at a mode of being wherein the world around us, the earth on which we stand and walk, and the sky above us no longer wear a familiar jaded guise of indifference or hostility. They rebirth in a magical form and inspire us to our higher lives, the ones we were actually born for. Herein we resume our relationship to the natural world and the cosmos. Here lies the sparkling possibility of freedom. We cannot afford to miss it this time. So that's where I'll close. Thank you for being so patient and giving me so much time.
Thank you, Professor Ashim Srivastava, and thank you, Professor Shrikant Gupta and Professor Purnamita Dasgupta. We have just a small little bit where I will request some of the faculty members here who have come today to say a few words in a very short time on Professor Bhattacharya. Is Professor Nando Non here? No, he's gone. Professor Shukonna Das, can you please come?
They should sit here, we can move.
Yeah. No.
Okay, thank you, Achiransu. So I thank, and maybe we have been associated with Sir. Maybe I was his student for a long time, starting from my master's when we have been offered the environmental economics as one of the optional paper in University of Calcutta, Katakol. So with that, we started an interaction. Maybe we were in a way two teachers, Professor Shurmila Banerjee and Professor Bhattacharya used to teach us. So we got a love with that specific subject. We grown with that. And after that, I was fortunate enough to have Sir as my supervisor for my MPhil as well as for my PhD. So the journey was quite long, and he is more to us as a teacher, to all of us who have been closely associated with him. So the journey is quite long, and might be it is much more than he knows each one of us. Like whenever we go, we meet Sir or through with our family. So it is a lot of much more rather than that of an academic front to that of the interaction with us. So thus we have been with teaching Sir book when we have done with environmental economics, and after that when he just in a way put us on the road, like when I've been told that okay, this time you will be using choice experiments, because that time it was pretty new, and he just let me on that road and tell that it is a process of learning that you have to go for. So that is the technique Sir used to put forward to us, like not specifically of spoon feeding, but giving a roadmap and to proceed and to give us the confidence, and that's we proceed across in our years so long. So then after that with Sir maybe and on his guidance, and later I joined Madras School of Economics in the same area of environmental economics. I've been there for 8 years before I moved to TERI in 2015. So the journey in this area has been quite long in the subject. Here also I was teaching the environmental economics, and with that Sir give us the suggestions when we come up in teaching for this specific course outline, having the suggestions from Professor Murthy and Professor Bhattacharya. So I think that as we have been in the discussion, it is an evolutionary process and it goes through with the type of the changes, and I hope that this book will also be a very good reference material, like the transition that we are going forward, and it's a very good collection, and I hope that we will be sharing with our students also. Thank you, Achiransu.
Thank you, Shukonna. I would request Dr. Indrani Rai Chaudhuri from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is an associate professor, to say a few words.
Yeah. Before I start talking about Professor Bhattacharya, I would like to compliment and congratulate you for the book. I haven't gone through the book, but I've seen the contents, and especially the foreword by Professor Dasgupta. It is commendable. Gathering so many best of minds in environmental economics, and then selecting the topics and then making it very pertinent and topical. So it's a commendable work. Thanks to you, and it is indeed a true tribute to Professor Bhattacharya. And with this word, I would like to be as brief as possible. But Professor Bhattacharya, I am not a direct student of him, but I share many special memories with him, and especially he came to my daughter's, I would like to be a little more personal. He came to my daughter's first birthday, which was celebrated in Calcutta, and blessed her. And there are many instances, academic, like I remember he is, as Purnamita Di rightly said, he has a very, very, what should I say? He has a huge emphasis on the fundamentals. So wherever there is something, some discussions, he would emphasize that what is the theory? What is, have you related with the theory? So this is something which is a remarkable takeaway from every interactions which I have. And I think I met him in Jadavpur University conference or in CSSS, in some of the routine seminars which actually happens there. So during that time, it was very informal, and he used to ask me that I was actually working on environmental economics, and I was looking for the topics, and there is no data as such. And we were of that generations, you know, when environmental economics was not rigorously introduced in the master's program as a course. Professor Ramprasad Sengupta started, but it was, I think it was little later when it was actually formalized. And in our center in CITD, Jawaharlal Nehru University, it was Professor Lokesh Borua who started, but I attended few topics, but not the entire course, because given my interest in theory, I was attending many theory courses rather than environment, but I was dragged to environment. So I was having lot of, you know, queries, and whenever there was some opportunities, I used to get lot of feedbacks from him. And I can remember some of these things which is very common to him whenever I would meet him, especially after joining Jamia. So several times I told him that I was missing teaching job, because I have a passion towards teaching. So he asked me that, what are you teaching? So in one occasion, I told him that apart from micro and maths, which was my, this semester, I have to teach development economics. I said, what are the topics you are teaching? So I said that I am just dwelling on Pranab Bardhan's one book, and then there is one book I got, which is on game theoretic applications on development, where the poverty traps, underdevelopments, and all these things are discussed in a very, very lucid manner. And he was so excited, said, what is the name of the book? I told him that it is Bruce Wydick or something like that. And he, you know, after 3-4 months, he wrote me a mail and saying that, Indrani, you mentioned about that book. Could you please send me the details of the reference? So this is the person, you know. And in several occasions, I know I especially after attending Sandy's, his rigorous lectures, more than 1 week, which he shared with Professor Dasgupta and Professor Miller. It was really, he actually gave me lot of, I was pushed into the, you know, these sub-themes of these natural resource economics, because in most of the university level courses are more concentrated on environmental economics. And this is basically the pollutions and externalities are the emphasis, but the natural resource and the optimal controls and the dynamic optimizations, this is not taught in a proper manner in our time. Now Terry is offering, and many other Madras schools has introduced, school is introducing. But so during that time, you know, teaching all these Hamilton's methods, optimal control theory was taught in CITD, but relating with natural resource economics, it was not done. And I actually, you know, I was so much influenced by his teaching. I started teaching actually in IGNU. They introduced only for 2 years some physical mode of teaching, which was recognized by Madras School of Economics at that time. And I shared a course where Professor Murthy used to teach the environmental economics, and I used to teach the natural resource economics. And I told him that, you know, you were the one who actually influenced me so much that I wanted to learn that the theories, because the algebras are very fascinating. So I told him that this is the book which I'm following, which is, I think, the Grafton's and some. So, and I sent him the reference because I knew that he will immediately write me that what is the book, please give me the details. So there are endless these kinds of, you know, memories I can talk about, but I don't want to, I have already taken so much time. So I will always share those fond memories. He's a remarkable teacher. So this generation is now gone, because now nobody will ask that what are you teaching now, because always we are assessed by the numbers of production of papers. So that generation, he will be fondly remembered, and the legacy, our great teachers, especially I came from Calcutta, so I got so many good teachers who actually told us that if you make a group of students happy, that is the most important takeaway from your academic life, rather than the number of publications. Obviously, the publication has importance, but what should I say, nurturing a group of young minds, that's it, something which is amazing, which is something which Professor Bhattacharya has taught us. So thanks a lot. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Indranidhi. Is Taposh here? Taposh Sarangi is he's the assistant director at Niti Aayog. Taposh, please say a few words.
Thank you, Achiransu, for the opportunity. Many things has been already spoken about Professor Rabindranath Bhattacharya, so I will be very brief about him. Maybe first time I met him during my master, when I was doing my master during 2000 to 2002, in a very small university situated in western part of Odisha. This is called Sambalpur University. And Professor Bhattacharya used to visit our university very regularly. That time the environmental economics was first introduced in the master course. And we have access to only one book in the market, and that book was edited by Professor R.N. Bhattacharya, which was published in Oxford University Press. And later one more book came, which was authored by U. Shankar. We have that time never seen the Kohlstadt, Becker's and others books. So for us, for student of our university, Professor Bhattacharya was just like a father of environmental economics. And one day, one of our professor called me and he told me that you should go to the railway station. We have invited Professor R.N. Bhattacharya for a lecture in a refresher course. So I just asked him for confirmation. Is it that person that whose books we are reading in masters? Then he said, yes, it is Professor R.N. Bhattacharya only. Then I went to that railway station to receive him, and I was just guessing how to identify Professor R.N. Bhattacharya. I saw a man just simple looking, carrying a small briefcase. Then I asked him, are you Professor R.N. Bhattacharya? He said, yes, I am Professor R.N. Bhattacharya. Then I was very nervous because from the railway station to the university, it will take 30 to 40 minutes by car. And if he will ask me something about environmental economics, then what should I will say? Because for us, that time, environmental economics was very new. Then he just started talking to me, just university stuff we are discussing. Then he asks, what are the books you are referring for your paper, environmental economics? Then I said, the only book we have, it's written by you only. Then I told him that some of our students, many of our students regard you as the father of environmental economics. Then he just smiled at me. And then he stayed there for 2-3 days. I used to visit the guest house where he was staying every evening. And he was very happy to clarify my doubts, very fundamental things, basic things I just asked him. But he just simply asks you for a pen and paper and he will explain just like a teacher's. And subsequently, every year he used to visit our department for various occasions, seminar, conference and other things. And I usually met him. And in later part of the years, maybe during 2012-14, when I was working at Center for Economic and Social Studies in Hyderabad, we had a center called Research Unit for Natural Resource and Livelihood, which was funded by Jamshedji Tata Trust, and Professor R.N. Bhattacharya was in the advisory board along with Professor N.S. Jodha. And he used to visit Hyderabad also, and whenever he landed in Hyderabad, he just called me. He called me Tapos, not Tapas. So he just called me, and I used to go to his room, and we'll discuss various aspects of environmental economics and all. So 3 things I have that has inspired me a lot from Professor R.N. Bhattacharya. His first thing is that his simplicity. The second thing is that his passion towards teaching, and the third thing is he is so pro for the students, and his love and affection has inspired me a lot. And on this occasion, lastly, I will just like to pay my tribute to Professor R.N. Bhattacharya, and I feel very lucky that I have spent a reasonable amount of time with him and learned a lot from him. Thank you, Achiransu, for the opportunity, and congratulations for this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Taposh. So we'll now close the session with a vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank the resource persons who came here. I'm grateful to Professor Purnamita Dasgupta, Professor Srikant Gupta, and Professor Ashim Srivastava for giving their precious time and for coming here. Thank you so very much. I'm thankful to everyone here who have come in honor of Professor Bhattacharya. I'm thankful to all of you, and I hope that we will carry forward his legacy. I would like to thank the IIC Indian International Center for hosting this program. I would like to thank Routledge and Satakshi Sinha for coming here, and I would like to thank all of you once again. The program ends here. Thank you very much.
Traveling. Thank you.
Same day.
So we finally got to. Yes.
Been hearing about you for the last
Well.